European fight comes to our shores. Hitler's U-boats waste no time going on the attack.
They brought the war to us in a way that caught us by surprise.
The attacks are devastating. Thousands of lives lost, more ships sunk than at Pearl Harbor, and Nazi spies secretly delivered to American soil.
They kicked our asses, and yet we were getting no payback.
A lot of Americans have forgotten how close the war came to our shores and how close it was to our homes.
Now, renowned explorer Robert Ballard and his team are returning to this forgotten battlefield with the latest technology.
Okay, team, 100 meters. Here we're able to get a picture that shows you what it would look like if you could take the water away.
Their work will help rewrite this chapter of World War II and bring closure to a 73-year-old mystery. Who sank German U-boat U-166? How close did the Nazis come to victory in the Atlantic? Right now, on this Nova National Geographic special.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the following. The David H. Koch Fund for Science, supporting NOVA and promoting public understanding of science. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by PBS viewers like you. Thank you.
The Gulf of Mexico, 120 miles off the coast of New Orleans. These peaceful waters were once the setting for a violent, little-known chapter of World War II. Deep below the surface lie the remnants of a devastating Nazi attack on America. Operation Drumbeat. Just after the U.S. entered World War II, Hitler's submarines, the deadly U-boats, struck hard and fast, up and down the East Coast. They hunted down and sank the vulnerable cargo ships that were critical to the Allied war effort. And they took the war further, extending their assault all the way into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, explorer Robert Ballard and his crew prepare to investigate this battlefield. To reach the sea floor, they'll use high-tech, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs.
The beauty of the ROVs, these vehicles can stay down for days and days and days.
Aaron just has a 6.8 wrap as well.
So he's going to come around to that.
Make sure that says
square up on the target and drive over to it.
The ROVs descend 1 mile beneath the surface, where the casualties of the Nazi assault still rest. A World War II-era cargo ship, the Alcoa Puritan. In 1942, she hauled aluminum ore vital to America's wartime factories. Her scars are still vivid.
Collision, but that's a hole. That's a shell hole. So if you could stop laterally and go in and frame that.
Yeah, these are bent inward.
Yeah, that you can tell it went in.
Yep.
Joining Ballard is wreck diver Richie Kohler. He's spent decades studying and diving on sunken U-boats.
This wreck is a snapshot of when the U-boats first came to America. This is when the U-boats were not afraid of us.
We hadn't got our act together.
Not far from the Alcoa, an oil tanker, the SS Gulf Penn. 90,000 barrels of oil still trapped inside.
These are, in some ways, ticking time bombs in the sense that the hull will rupture and you'll have oil come out. Could you look at that wreckage?
Yeah, we have some wreckage
Could
here.
you look at that wreckage before you go too far?
But Ballard and Kohler's ultimate goal is a pair of shipwrecks resting not far away. One the hunter, the other hunted. This is the SS Robert E. Lee, the victim. In 1942, 407 souls walked these decks.
On board the Robert E. Lee was not only passengers, but there were actually survivors from previous German U-boat sinkings that occurred out in the Atlantic Ocean.
Square on the gun a little better.
A 3-inch deck gun had been added for protection against the U-boat threat.
This gun never went into play. They never had a target.
He's
manned the
locked up.
boats.
Yeah, he's in a stored position.
The attack came with almost no warning.
You can almost imagine them standing along the side, looking at what they thought was a porpoise, and then it makes a turn and comes into them. It's actually a torpedo.
Today, the fatal wound inflicted by the German torpedo is hidden beneath layers of silt on the ocean floor.
It's amazing that most of the damage is not visible.
No, we're looking at a ghost ship. I mean, it's obvious that it was abandoned. We could see where the 4 lifeboat davits were swung out. Within 5 minutes, these people were in the water, fighting for their lives.
Just over 1 mile away, the attacker, German U-boat U-166. Missing for 59 years, her rusting hull was spotted in May 2001 during survey work for a new underwater pipeline. But how did U-166 sink? Who was responsible? And why is she lying so close to her victim? The official record offers little clue. For decades, the circumstances of this U-boat sinking have been mired in controversy. In 1942, a young destroyer captain, Commander Herbert Claudius, claimed credit for the kill. But the official report said Claudius botched the attack. It was one man's word against the U.S. Navy in a case obscured by the fog of war. Ballard and his team believe their technology, building on the earlier survey work, can finally put the question to rest.
It isn't until fairly recently that this submarine's been found. I'm going to use my technology and see if an injustice was done that needs to be corrected.
It's a story that began 3 years before U-166 was sunk, before America had even entered the war, when Great Britain found itself facing off against Nazi Germany in one of the most pivotal conflicts of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic. Lasting from the first day of the war to the very end, the fighting would ultimately claim nearly 6,000 Allied and German ships and span 5,000 miles of ocean.
What was at stake was simply Allied survival in World War II. Now, at this stage of the war, England was standing alone against the rest of Europe, which had been conquered and brought under Nazi tyranny.
If the British were defeated, the war would be all but lost.
There was no way that the Allies were going to be able to invade Normandy from Hoboken, New Jersey. It just wouldn't have worked. You needed a launch pad. The launch pad was England.
But as an island nation, Britain was vulnerable. Its survival depended on supplies imported from abroad, raw materials, food, weapons, roughly 1 million tons of cargo a year crossing the Atlantic. By 1941, the Nazis were close to cutting off that flow. The key to their success was the Unterseeboot, German for underwater boat, known to the rest of the world as the U-boat. The Nazis built nearly 1,200 of these deadly machines. They were meant for one purpose only: to attack. At either end of the U-boat were tubes for launching torpedoes, 23-foot-long underwater missiles. At its center, the conning tower. Below it, a maze of controls for steering, diving, and surfacing. Submerged, a U-boat's survival depended on its pressure hull. Invisible from outside, these structural ribs and steel plate were all that stood between the crew and thousands of tons of seawater. Like today's hybrid cars, U-boats relied on a combination of internal combustion engines and battery-powered electric motors for propulsion. On the surface, air-breathing diesels could drive up to 18 knots, roughly 20 miles an hour. Underwater, the electric motors took over, but the batteries were a critical vulnerability. They typically lasted less than 24 hours, and the diesel engines could only recharge them on the surface.
A U-boat is ultimately a submersible rather than a true submarine. It's not intended to operate perpetually beneath the water. They have to be on the surface several hours every day in order to recharge their batteries.
And a U-boat on the surface was a target. Despite this weakness, the U-boats were stunningly effective.
The U-boat was a terrifying weapon of war, and it was especially terrifying when it took on unarmed ships that were carrying cargo.
Commanding the German assault was Kriegsmarine Admiral Karl Dönitz.
During World War I, he commanded a German U-boat. That's where he learns a lot of his lessons.
He could be harsh at times, but the U-boat men considered him a just leader, and that's why they followed him all through the war.
With the U.S. still neutral, Dönitz focused his fleet on the British ships. Wolf packs, groups of U-boats ranging from 3 to more than 20 subs, swarmed and overwhelmed the British convoys. Dönitz directed the wolf packs himself via long-range radio.
Admiral Dönitz was a very hands-on type of manager. He wanted to know where his U-boats were at all times. He required them to call in on a daily basis.
The Allies could hear the transmissions, but they couldn't understand them. The Germans had a secret weapon, the code machine known as Enigma.
The Enigma machine itself looks like a very elaborate typewriter that encodes and decrypts the messages as they're sent and received.
The secret of the Enigma machine was its constantly changing code. With every keystroke, the code rotors that scrambled the message shifted slightly, generating a new code. No word would ever be encoded the same way twice. Every day, the sender and receiver set the rotors to a position listed in code books each operator carried. The Allies had secretly copied one of the machines, but without knowing the settings, they had no hope of deciphering the messages. By 1941, the Enigma-equipped U-boats were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. England was being starved into submission.
In fact, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later say that there was only one thing that he feared during World War II, and it was the U-boat.
Then, a breakthrough. In May of 1941, U-110 stopped reporting in. German command believed her sunk. In reality, she had been captured off the coast of Iceland. Her Enigma machine and the code book specifying the settings were shipped back to London. British mathematician Alan Turing and a secret team of codebreakers went to work.
The British were able to break the German naval ciphers by the end of May, beginning of June 1941. That was critical for saving British convoys for the rest of 1941.
The Germans had no idea. Mathematics, not munitions, had bought the British crucial time. Until December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor And everything changed. With America officially at war, U.S. ships could now be targeted. Admiral Dönitz seized the opportunity to tilt the battle back in Germany's favor.
He knows that right after Pearl Harbor, if he sends U-boats across to attack the U.S. Atlantic coast, he knows he'll get a big payoff because the United States won't be ready.
Dönitz believed his U-boats could cut England's lifeline of vital cargo by striking at the source. Operation Drumbeat was born. But with his U-boats stretched thin, Dönitz had only a handful of long-range boats, known as Type 9s, available to send to America.
He assigns 6 Type 9 U-boats, and then one of them falls out, so it's only initially 5 Type 9 U-boats to operate off the U.S. East Coast.
The trip to America took 3 weeks. British codebreakers warned the U.S., but in the wake of Pearl Harbor, the Navy had other priorities.
Neither the U.S. Navy nor the Army Air Forces was prepared. Not only did they not have the airplanes and the ships available, but the ones they did have available did not have the sensors or weapons that could destroy a U-boat.
Even basic protective measures were ignored.
You got to remember, all of Europe is blacked out now, and all the lights are on. There seems to be no alerts whatsoever.
Officials worried a blackout could disrupt commerce. But no blackouts meant cargo ships were perfectly silhouetted against the bright lights.
They found, in effect, U-boat Disneyland. It was wonderful.
Horst von Schroeder was watch officer on U-123.
We closed the shore within, say, 2 or 3 nautical miles. We smelled the forest ashore, and we saw the autos, the cars running on the shoreway.
Erich Topp was commander of U-552 and the 3rd most successful U-boat commander of the war.
It was a shooting of hares. It was because the Americans at that time had not developed the countermeasures against submarines. And so we had a very easy game there.
It took 1 week, as I remember, only. 1 week all the time, and we sank, I think, about 10 ships.
In fact, they returned to their ports on the Bay of Biscay coast of France, empty, having fired all of their torpedoes.
By February 6th, barely 3 weeks after the first U-boats arrived in U.S. waters, they'd sunk 25 ships. Spurred on by the success, Dönitz sent every U-boat he could spare across the Atlantic, including the newly built U-166, the wreck Ballard is closing in on. On board the Nautilus, Ballard's team preps the ROVs. The primary unit, named Hercules, is equipped with several high-definition cameras. Its sophisticated sonar will locate and map the wreck site. This technology will offer a view of the U-boat with stunning clarity and detail. Hercules can dive as deep as 2.5 miles, putting U-166 well within its reach. But just like human divers, it doesn't go alone. Hercules is tethered to a second ROV, named Argus. Physically linked to the ship above, Argus acts as a stabilizer and light source for Hercules. It also sends video up to the Nautilus, so the crew can watch for potential hazards. Hercules is kept on a short leash to prevent its tether from getting tangled. Operating the ROVs like this is tricky. The ship's computers must maintain its position directly above the wreck, so the ROVs can safely navigate the site.
So the computers are driving the ship. Humans aren't driving the ship right now. It's being driven by computers. As we move the ship, we're moving Argus. And Hercules' job is to stay out on point.
It will take over an hour for the ROVs to reach the wreck of U-166. By March of 1942, Dönitz was sending nearly half of his combat-ready U-boats to attack America. The Germans had also regained a crucial advantage, a new Enigma machine.
The German Navy increasingly suspects that their Cypher machine has been compromised, as indeed it has been.
Dönitz upgraded the Enigma machines on board his U-boats with an additional rotor. Overnight, the new machine, nicknamed Shark by the Allies, made their code-breaking useless.
From then on, the Germans were well ahead in terms of information, because the Allies no longer could read what the Germans were planning.
For Dönitz and the U-boats, the hunting was almost too good. They kept running out of torpedoes and fuel and had to travel 3,500 miles back home to resupply. Until German engineers came up with an inventive shortcut, the Type 14 U-boat, dubbed the Milk Cow. The milk cows were not designed to fight.
Instead of carrying offensive weapons, they just carried extra fuel and provisions and even extra torpedoes for the U-boats.
With 430 tons of fuel and supplies, the milk cows were floating gas stations. And the Germans had an ideal location to deploy them: the Atlantic Gap.
Aircraft based in North America, aircraft based in Iceland or Greenland or in the United Kingdom, their umbrella of coverage left a gap right in the middle. That mid-Atlantic gap was an area where U-boats knew that they could operate with impunity because no Allied aircraft could reach that gap.
The Germans seemed to hold every advantage. The U-boats were virtually unstoppable. By April of 1942, 3 months into Operation Drumbeat, nearly 250 Allied ships had been lost in American waters. Not a single U-boat had been sunk.
Happy times, they called it. In Germany, die glückliche Zeit. There were more targets available than they could cope with.
And the U-boat missions were only becoming bolder. In June 1942, the Nazis carried out one of their most daring attacks on America. Known as Operation Pastorius, the program used U-boats to land teams of Nazi spies on American soil.
The overall plan was that German saboteurs and spies would attack vital railroad bridges, aluminum plants that were making the skin of the aircraft that would ultimately drop bombs on German cities, and the U-boat contribution to this mission was vital. It couldn't have been done without them.
2 teams of spies were landed, one on Long Island, New York, the other near Jacksonville, Florida. The spies dispersed into the civilian population and began their preparations. Meanwhile, Dönitz and the U-boats kept probing American defenses. They soon identified an enticing new weak spot: the shipping lanes in the Gulf of Mexico.
We had lapsed into the thinking that everything's fine in the Gulf of Mexico because the enemy is not there. And so Dönitz sends them into the Gulf of Mexico, realizing that he'll get yet another big payoff with the Gulf of Mexico. And oh God, what a payoff he got. In the month of May 1942, he sank 41 ships. That's more than 1 ship a day going down in flames in the Gulf of Mexico.
It was to this hunting ground that U-166 would be assigned for her first patrol in America. Home movies recorded by U-166's captain, Hans Gunther Kuhlmann, show the young crew training just weeks before the mission. On June 17, 1942, they left port and set course for America. They would never be seen again.
6 meters.
There's bottom.
There you go.
Aboard the Nautilus, Bob Ballard is trying to understand their final moments.
What's it say, target bearing?
Target bearing is 230.
Yeah, so it should show up on sonar. They're coming down close. They know it.
After reaching American waters in July of 1942, U-166 quickly sank 3 ships and was looking for more off the coast of Louisiana. On the afternoon of July 30th, another target appeared in her sights. The Robert E. Lee, making its way to New Orleans. U-166 launched a single torpedo. The passenger ship never fired a shot in return. Within minutes, it was sunk. But what U-166 didn't realize was that the Robert E. Lee was not alone. She had a naval escort ship, PC-566. Its captain was a young naval officer, Herbert Gordon Claudius.
Well, he was a farm boy from Nebraska, and he, I guess, wanted to get out of Nebraska. And then, of course, his first ship in the Navy was the PC-566.
PC-566 had been commissioned only the month before. Claudius and his crew were about to see combat for the very first time.
As soon as a German torpedo struck Robert E. Lee, Claudius swings the PC-566 into action. One of the men on deck of PC-566 observes a periscope in the water. Claudius then turns the vessel toward that periscope sighting. He's doing that in an attempt to approach from its blind side.
A U-boat's periscope has a narrow field of view. With the U-166's lens pointed at the sinking Robert E. Lee, the German captain couldn't see the Navy ship coming.
He's in the fray right now. He's trying to kill this guy. He wants to sneak right up on top of that guy so he can't get away.
He's bearing down on it as fast as he can, and when he's 120 yards away, he sees the periscope retract.
He's following the wake and directly over the estimated position, setting off a sequential series of 5 depth charges.
The depth charge is an underwater bomb and the Allies' primary weapon against U-boats. The attacking ship estimates the location and depth of the U-boat, then sets the charges to detonate when they hit that depth.
Fire 2. Fire 2.
Water pressure triggers the explosion, sending a shockwave ripping through the ocean. The explosion isn't powerful enough to blow up a U-boat. The idea is to simply crack its pressure hull. Then let thousands of tons of seawater finish the job. But depth charges aren't necessarily a death sentence. The shockwave is only dangerous up close. If the U-boat can dive out of range, she can escape. U-boat crews had a series of carefully rehearsed procedures for trying to elude depth charges, as shown in this actual wartime footage. The bow planes were set to maximum angle, driving the boat deeper. The electric motors were set to full power. Men who were not on duty ran forward. Their weight helped point the boat down. The emergency dive was the most critical test a U-boat crew could face. Seconds meant the difference between life and death. Horst von Schroeter was watch officer on one of the first U-boats in Drumbeat, U-123.
From the order alarm, it took 30 seconds to disappear from the surface and another 30 seconds to be on a depth of 60 meters. 30 seconds can be a long time in war.
Werner Hirschmann was chief engineer on U-190.
I would call anybody who was not scared for his life under those circumstances a liar, because it is a scary experience to hear a depth charge dropping into the water and then expect in about 5 or 10 seconds an explosion to go off. There's nothing you can do. You can just sit there and wait. And this period of lack of activity is really unnerving.
The crew of U-166 left no record of their final moments. They didn't send a radio report that day, or even a distress signal. All that is known comes from the report filed by Claudius. He dropped a second round of depth charges. An oil slick spread on the surface.
So now the periscope's no longer visible. The depth charges have gone off. There's no wake. You know, did he kill it? And he sees an oil slick. You know, that's a very good indication that he hit it.
In his report, Claudius was clear.
It is my opinion that the sub was sunk or so mortally wounded that she would never return to her base.
I mean, this is the fog of war. But he's pretty confident that that oil slick is associated with that submarine.
They attack the submarine, they come back and rescue the survivors. The 400 people that are in the water from the Robert E. Lee.
Claudius radioed for help, knowing that his ship was too small to rescue everyone.
It's not that big a ship. It was so top-heavy that he actually had to unload some of them back into lifeboats so that his ship became stable. But then 2 other ships came out, and between the 3 boats, they took them back to New Orleans.
Claudius returned to port with the survivors. Then, a shock.
But instead of getting a hero's welcome, he was actually reprimanded. His entire attack is criticized. As a matter of fact, he's removed from command and then sent back to school. They didn't believe, not for 1 minute, that he had actually sunk the U-166.
Senior commanders concluded that Claudius made a series of basic errors. They said he was in the wrong position while escorting the Robert E. Lee. He approached the U-boat the wrong way, and crucially, he deployed his depth charges too slowly and at the wrong depths.
They're all saying, no way, no way did he sink this sub. The attack was poorly conducted, and there is insufficient evidence to give higher assessment than an F. An F. It says F right there. He flunked. That's pretty humiliating.
Gordon Claudius, Herbert's son, was only 2 years old at the time. He believes the review of his father was unfair.
It was not favorable. He didn't talk much about, his wartime activities. My sister, she was older than I was and more in a position to think about things and ask questions. And she said, well, she asked him one time, and all he said was, well, he attacked a submarine, and he saw oil slick, and he saw debris. That was it. I think it not only got to my father, but I think it got to the whole crew.
After the war, captured German records revealed that U-166 was the only U-boat lost in the Gulf. But the Navy concluded that U-166 had been sunk in an entirely different attack that took place 2 days later and 140 miles from where Commander Claudius gave chase.
A U-boat is spotted south of Houma, Louisiana, running on the surface. And a U.S. Coast Guard patrol plane attacks it with depth charges, and then in the aftermath of the attack observes an oil slick on the surface of the water.
The Coast Guard air crew was given credit for the kill. And so, official history was written. Yet despite decades of searching, a wrecked U-boat was never found at the location where the Coast Guard plane made its attack.
It's not for a lack of trying. People are going out on dive expeditions thinking that they have the exact spot where U-166 went down, but nobody finds it.
Until 2001, when marine archaeologists from CNC Technologies made a surprising discovery during preparations for an undersea pipeline.
When we were looking at the extra data and we saw the bow section, and at that point, we looked at each other and we're like, all the pieces came together. And it turns out that it was the U-166.
We knew at that moment that Lieutenant Commander Claudius and the crew of PC-566 had sank U-166.
Yet 13 years later, the Navy record still denies Claudius credit.
So now we need to set the record straight, because this guy died without recognition for what he did.
Unless Bob Ballard and Richie Kohler can find a way to prove to the Navy that Claudius was responsible, the official record will stand as is. A mile below, Ballard's ROVs are closing in on the wrecked U-boat.
All right, it's showtime. Let's drop down. They're dropping down. There it is. There she blows.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
She is in incredible condition, right where the previous survey said she would be.
Part of the submarine looks like we could just blow off the dust, start the engines, and go.
Right.
250 feet long, weighing 1,100 tons. In 1942, U-166 was a state-of-the-art killing machine. Now, she is a tomb.
Oh my gosh, that's a gun.
So far, no damage is apparent.
Back up a little, frame her a little. Right there, okay, go in and focus it.
Though Richie Kohler sees evidence that the crew of U-166 knew they were in danger.
There was a couple of telltale signs that this sub was in a crash dive or trying to get down real quick. Number one, the aerial, the antenna that you see that's bent,
right,
that's a transmitting antenna.
So it wasn't,
it's supposed to be retracted when they're diving.
So he was too busy to do that.
Everything stopped. We've got the 20mm gun that should have been locked in position for underwater travel. It's swung out to port. Periscope never came back down all the way. You can almost, see these men running to the forward end of the submarine, trying to get the bow heavier, trying to get it down, because they knew trouble was coming.
And they didn't make it.
They didn't make it.
It does appear the sub was running for its life. But so far, they see no sign of the telltale fractures in the hull that 2 rounds of depth charges should have produced. The wreck seems surprisingly intact. And then, something strange.
Now that's not normal. Could you stop right there, Will, and zoom in on that?
Ballard zooms in, looking for the bow, the front of the sub. It appears to be buried in the sand,
Whenever you see something like that,
but it's not. It's completely gone. There's no way a depth charge could have sheared off the bow of U-166 like this. So, what happened? The missing bow holds vital clues.
We gotta go find the other piece.
The ROVs move out across the sand. For many meters, there's nothing. Then, suddenly, it's the missing bow. And it's been reduced to scrap metal. This is definitely not a depth charge.
If that was a depth charge, we would not see this thin lattice work. This would have been totally blown away.
Normally, a depth charge just cracks the pressure hull. But this is no fracture. It's an amputation.
Most of the time we see concave indents from depth charges. We don't see twisted and torn metal. With this level of destruction, it makes it difficult to ascertain what caused what.
Up, down.
It's a conundrum. The location supports Claudius's claim that he sank this boat. But the damage doesn't match a normal depth charge attack like the one Claudius made. To understand what happened, the team needs to put the 2 pieces of U-166 back together.
No, we know that we've got this up in the bow, separated, and then we don't know how much
Well,
of this
you know,
is
it'll be
in the
interesting. We take the 2 pieces, and we see how much of it we see. Put them together, and you see what you're missing.
But the visibility is too murky to image the entire wreck in one shot.
Well, we can't see very far underwater. I mean, if you're lucky, you can see 30, 40 feet.
Fortunately, Ballard's ROVs are equipped for just such conditions.
What we'll do now is we've now outlined, and so we need to bring Clara up. Is Clara in the ready? So we can digitize this whole thing.
Clara Smart is the team's high-resolution mapping specialist. As she watches, the ROV does a sweep of the wreck, taking thousands of close-up photographs with its ultra-high-resolution cameras.
The vehicle takes one image every 3 seconds. And what we're going to do is we're going to combine all these images to create one very big, beautiful images.
You can see it's marching along.
Yep, and it's just matching one picture to the next. The whole idea overall is when we are on a site, we have, a flashlight in a hayfield, and we can't see anything. But once we make these maps, all of a sudden, like, all the lights came on. So we truly see exactly what's down there.
Clara will spend the next several months stitching the thousands of close-ups into a single giant wide shot called a photo mosaic that shows the entire wreck. Every rivet and crack will be visible with unmatched clarity.
Here we're able to get a picture you can't get any other way. A map that shows you what it would look like if you could take the water away. And that'll help tell us what happened to the submarine.
Back at the University of Rhode Island, Clara gets to work. To start, computers assemble the images, but they can only do so much.
So you can see we've got some issues.
In problem areas, Clara will have to match individual frames by eye. It's a laborious process. Finally, Ballard calls Richie Kohler and historian Marty Morgan to his lab. The mosaic of U-166 is complete. Thousands of photographs have been seamlessly meshed together. But will the mosaic give the team what they need?
We took about 2,000 images with the ROV, and that's been boiled down to these two mosaics.
So this is really CSI. We're talking about 2,000 pictures to give us one continuous image of what the U-166 looks like now.
It's right, and it would be as if you were flying over with an airplane, you saw an aerial view.
The key evidence lies somewhere in the break between the two pieces.
That's where it all took place. The fact that this has been completely blown off.
And 100 meters away.
And 100 meters away. The question is, was the depth charge enough power to literally tear off the front of a pressure hull?
It's not really been seen before in almost every instance.
So you're led to believe that there was another culprit in the mix.
When the two pieces of U-166 are slid back together, they see that the break occurred right at the forward torpedo room.
Interesting enough, right here, where my finger is exactly where the torpedo tubes would have been loaded. You can see them clearly in the blueprints. We know they're there, but something destroyed the torpedo tubes.
Yeah. And there's how many torpedoes here?
There could have been four.
Four on the deck, 4 spare reloads.
Spare torpedoes were stored on the floor of the two torpedo rooms, bow and stern. If the forward torpedoes somehow exploded while stored inside U-166, that could explain the incredible damage to her bow. If that is what happened, it points to an unlikely and catastrophic chain of events. As U-166 frantically dove to escape, Commander Herbert Claudius dropped his depth charges.
So they were pretty shallow.
Well, they were seen on the surface with their periscope up.
This is what has led me to believe the possibility of one of the 5 depth charges that were distributed by PC-566 landed on the deck there.
And it carried it with it.
Marty Morgan believes a depth charge landed directly on top of U-166. As the sub dove to escape, she carried the bomb down to its explosion depth, setting off a chain reaction that detonated her own torpedoes.
That would make sense because Clearly, it was so instant. He's just putting his periscope down. His dive angle isn't that
He
great.
probably wasn't even 30 feet deep.
Right. So it very conceivably landed on him, clunk, and he carried the bomb down
Carries
with
it down with him.
Hustling forward to weigh down the bow, the crew might have run right into the exploding torpedo room.
If you understand how the German submarines would dive, one of the things they would use the crew for is ballast. They would tell the crew to run,
Run to the front.
and that's exactly where it happened.
The team is convinced. While a depth charge couldn't produce the damage seen on U-166, it could have detonated her torpedoes. Combined with the U-boat's location, it makes a persuasive argument. Instead of being reprimanded for his attack, Commander Herbert Claudius should have gotten a medal.
A nice shot. Perfect shot, actually. Couldn't have done it better.
But the team still faces a huge hurdle, convincing the U.S. Navy. Ballard, a former Navy commander himself, puts their findings in writing and forwards them to the Chief of Naval Operations, the most senior officer in the Navy. 73 years after the battle, the Navy agrees to review the case. Though it wasn't apparent in 1942, even as U-166 sank to the bottom, Operation Drumbeat was already drawing to a close.
The sinking of 166, this is the first time we actually, in the Gulf of Mexico, drew blood.
Didn't mean that we had taken the teeth away from the U-boats. No, they were going to continue to sink ships, but now it was going to cost them. It was going to cost them dearly.
Allied science and engineering were finally beginning to turn the tide. Improved radar and high-frequency direction finding meant the U-boats could be detected whenever they surfaced, even at night. While mass production of aircraft like the B-24 Liberator meant the Atlantic Gap was no longer a safe haven for the milk cows. But the decisive stroke came with the capture of U-559 in October of 1942.
What they get out of U-559 enables Allied codebreakers to regain that insight into the new Enigma machine with its fourth rotor. And by the end of December 1942, and certainly by the spring of 1943, the British and Americans can now read German U-boat signals in almost real time.
The Enigma code was cracked once again. The U-boats had lost nearly all their advantages. Even the Nazi spies of Operation Pastorius, landed via U-boat to sabotage American industry, proved to be utter failures. All 8 operatives were captured within days, and the Germans canceled the program. Never again would U-boats rule the seas. They had failed in their stated goal, cutting off the flow of supplies from America to England. Yet they had come dangerously close. And the damage caused by their attacks was immense. Hitler's U-boats sank 609 ships in American protected waters. Over 3 million tons of cargo never made it to Britain. And over 5,000 lives were lost. On the German side, out of the 743 U-boats lost in World War II, only 10 were sunk in American waters. Of those, only 1 was sunk in the Gulf of Mexico, U-166. But will the Navy give credit to Commander Claudius? At the Navy History and Heritage Command, historians have analyzed Ballard's evidence, as well as reports from the marine archaeologists that first ID'd U-166. The two teams are nearly lockstep in their conclusions. It was Commander Claudius and his naval escort ship, PC-566.
The Underwater Archaeology Branch here at Naval History and Heritage Command looked at the information and confirmed that absolutely we believe that PC-566 did successfully attack and sink U-166. Whether it was skill, whether it was luck, or a combination of both, they were successful in the end.
In 2014, 72 years after the battle, Admiral Jonathan Greenert, Chief of Naval Operations, and Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, award Commander Herbert Claudius the Legion of Merit.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and we're here to recognize and actually to honor Lieutenant Commander Herbert G. Claudius. This is really, for me, a story, I think, of history, obviously, but also a story of explorers, of shipmates, of friends, historians, and I think relentlessness to set the record straight.
Gordon Claudius, the only surviving child of Herbert Claudius, is here to accept the award on his father's behalf.
Now, 70 years later, because of technology, we now know that your father's after-action report was absolutely accurate. And I think this is a good example of it's never too late to set the record straight. It's never too late to do the right thing. So it's an honor to be here today to present your father posthumously with the Legion of Merit for valiant actions during a very tough and very dangerous combat situation. On behalf of your father,
Thank you.
present this with you with the V for Valor, which means it happened in combat.
It sure did.
This really brings closure on a story that began a month before I was born 73 years ago. So this is a wrap, a nice wrap.
So long after the conflict, World War II is fading history. Few remember the battles Herbert Claudius and other heroes once fought, so close to our shores. But the sunken remains are still there, often nearer than we know. Enduring reminders of just how close the Nazis came to setting history on a very different path.